Good morning. Welcome to Research Study Assumptions, a brief presentation on the nature of assumptions in research studies versus traditional assumptions that we use in everyday life. I'm Paula DeWitowitz, and I will be giving this presentation today. So let's get started. An assumption, as we normally think of it, is something that we presume to be true in any kind of environment. So I assume that the sun will come up tomorrow. I assume that the sun will go down tonight. I assume that there will be people who are happy, there will be people who are sad, that something terrible will happen somewhere in the world and something wonderful will happen somewhere else. Those are the traditional kinds of things we think of as assumptions. However, in a research study, we're much more specific about what an assumption means. Now, assumptions are normally presented in Chapter 1 in a traditional 5 chapters dissertation presentation. They're also discussed a little bit when you talk about the limitations in Chapter 5 as you summarize the things that have limited the nature of your study, but are very limited, discussed in a very limited way there, if discussed very much at all. Normally, they are revised at the end of a study if you determine that you had to assume something else, but are presented traditionally during the development of the proposal in Chapter 1. So that's really where I'm going to focus, that kind of Chapter 1 assumption that we make for research studies. Some definitions that are presented in different texts include the idea that an assumption is a working axiom that lies behind the methodology or conditions that are taken for granted without which the research project would be pointless. This second definition, presented by Leedy and Ormond and discussed later in a book that we use at Walden as a text, really sums up, although not quite as clearly as I'm going to present, what a research assumption is. So let's talk a little bit more about what the condition of taking something for granted without which the research project would be pointless would be. Essentially, an assumption is something that must be true for your study to be valid, okay? It must be something that is related to your research design, some critical part of your research design that must be true and that you can present as being true through some research and some logical development of your study parameters that must be true in order for your study to be valid. Still a little bit of gobbledygook, but getting a little bit closer. Okay, parts of a study design that you cannot control that must be true for the study to be valid. Here are some examples of assumptions that people make when developing studies that are really not assumptions, and I'll explain why as I discuss each of them. You can control whether your sample or population is appropriate. When you start to design your study, you want to select the people who are optimal for giving you the information that you need to answer your question to fill your research gap. The problem is that you cannot guarantee that those people are the right people, can you? Yes, you can. If you are looking for first-year teachers, you can make sure that you interview first-year teachers. If you are looking for juniors in college, you can make sure that you're screening juniors in college. So you can control whether your sample or population is appropriate for your study. Can you control what information they will give you? No, you cannot. So you cannot assume that they're going to be the right people to give you the information that you want if you are determined that you're going to find a specific answer. What you want to be able to say is, this is the population I need to get the information that I need, whether it's positive, negative. I'm not assuming it's going to be positive or negative, just this is the right group to talk to get the information about whether something is positive or negative and to understand its nature. So you can control whether your sample or population is the appropriate population to approach to direct. You can control whether your questions, instruments, and data sources are appropriate. Often people will make a comment that they assume that they're asking the right questions, or they assume that they're using the right data source to get the answers that they need to be able to fill the research gap. In fact, you can control what questions you ask, what instruments you use, what data sources you go after. So you cannot make that as an assumption. You have to choose the best questions, the best instruments, the best data sources to which you can gain access to be able to answer your questions. That part is incumbent on you to do your best at. And that is why it is not an assumption, it is something that you can control. You can control whether your analysis is appropriate. Are you using the appropriate analysis method? You decide. You determine based on an examination of all of the different possibilities which data analysis method is appropriate. You can control whether the school you select is using the program you selected. All right, you can control that. You screen to make sure that the conditions, that the requirements for the school, the district, the classroom are appropriate for your study. Now, you cannot control whether they are using X, Y, or Z program with fidelity necessarily, unless you have questions that ask, are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Or how often have you done this? How often have you done that as part of your pre-screening process? If you do that, then you have even more control over whether or not the school, the district, the classroom you're choosing is appropriate. But you can control whether they are at least using the program that you're thinking of researching if you're choosing a program, or that they fit whatever other criteria, similar kinds of criteria you might. Here's the point. You can screen for as much as possible, and it is incumbent on you when you can screen to be able to do that and to be doing that. You can control screening for certain criteria, as I mentioned just above, whether you're looking at whether there's a single parent family, a multiple working parent family, whatever, when you're trying to consider how families interact with a school system, for example. So you need to screen for anything that you can screen for. You must control as much as possible the characteristics of your population, your samples, your participants, the location, those kinds of things in order for your study to be valid. So an assumption is not about anything that you can control. It deals with the nature of your study and the nature of those pieces of your study that you cannot control. Okay, so you can control whether or not your topic is appropriate. You can control whether or not people should know something, okay, in that you can ask them, but you cannot assume that they should absolutely know something, can you? You cannot assume that they must know that X, Y, or Z program has as its precepts these 4 different characteristics, that special education programs require X, Y, or Z. Those are things that you can ask about. You need to ask about. Do you understand this? Do you understand that? If you don't screen for that when you begin, then you ask those as basic questions when you start conducting your interviews, so that you know that your population, your sample, your participants have the level of knowledge that you need, or that you understand if they don't, and can treat the data that you acquire from them appropriately. The other reason you cannot assume that people should know something is that you cannot be judgmental. So in certain cases, we will say, faculty should know about this, parents should know about this. There is no guarantee that, number one, they will, and number two, that they should, depending on your point. If you know are saying, for example, that they should know that people need to eat, that's a basic. But if you're saying, for example, that they should know how a program works, that's not always guaranteed. So you need to be careful not to be making those kinds of assumptions that are really related to judgment. So just keep that in mind as well. Those are not appropriate to make. They are never study assumptions, and they should not be assumptions that you make within a study in any way because they indicate a bias, which is something that you're supposed to control. You cannot control whether or not something is essential to your participants, things like training or whatever. You cannot make an assumption that that is going on. You need to check on it. If that's a criterion for participation in your study, then you need to ask them. The thing that you can assume is that when you have asked them something like that they're telling you the truth. So if you say, for example, that a criterion for participation is being in your first year of teaching, you ask them about that. And then if they say yes, one of the assumptions of your study is that the participants were honest with you about their level of experience with teaching. So that's how this works. You cannot assume that you're right about people needing something, wanting something, knowing something. Those are not study design parameters. Those are, number one, bias points. Number two, expectations for your study, parameters for your study that you need to ask about, that you need to be prepared to check before you conduct your study, before you recruit people, before you finalize your design. So, research study assumptions are design parameters that you cannot control that must be true for the study to be valid. What does that really mean then? Here are some valid assumptions that you can make, that people are going to be honest. Okay, they could be honest about knowing something, about knowing about something, about having experienced something, about being a certain age, having a certain level of experience, having a certain level of knowledge about something, having a certain level of experience with something. Whatever other parameters are required for your study, population or participants, for your environment, or any other factors related to your study to be valid, you need to be able to trust the people to be honest. So when you're putting together your assumptions, the bulk of those are going to be related to whether or not people are being honest, whether or not you have honestly gained all of the information you need about the location or the population or the setting to be able to trust that your study is valid if everything is true. Another example, other than people being honest, that the setting is using X, Y, or Z program with fidelity. So you check to make sure that they're using the program, and then you check to see if there are some details to let you know that they're doing it with fidelity. And then you trust that the people are using it with fidelity and can give you information about that program because they're using it with fidelity. So it comes back to whether or not the situation is honestly assessed, not whether or not you're using the right kind of materials, the right kind of people, the right kind of resources, the right kind of data. Those kinds of issues are issues you can check, you can control. And it is incumbent on you as a researcher to do that. A research study assumption is something that is essential to the validity of your study design that you cannot control. People being honest about any number of things, which should each be listed specifically and separately in your assumptions. The setting being true to whatever program, population, a true representation of based on the data that you required, those kinds of things. Those are appropriate assumptions. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, please remember that you can always email me. My email address is on the first slide. I'm available whenever you need me, and please keep in touch. Thank you for participating. Goodbye.